Welcome back to a part 3. This story is very interesting. Please sit and watch this video.
Michael Ezzy stood at the window of the small, sparsely furnished apartment he had rented under a name that was not entirely a lie. Ezzy had been his grandmother's maiden name. After all, a thread of truth he clung to whenever the guilt of his deception threatened to swallow him whole. Below, the streets of Addis stirred with the golden haze of late afternoon, hawkers calling out the names of their wares, children chasing a half-deflated football between stalls of roasted corn and folded Ankara cloth. It was a world so far removed from the marble floors of the Williams estate that sometimes, standing here, he forgot he had ever belonged to that other life at all. He was still holding the phone in his hand, Norah's parting words echoing in his ears, "Enjoy your poverty while it lasts," and he found himself smiling despite the sting buried inside the joke. Norah had always had a gift for wrapping truth in humor, sharp enough to cut, gentle enough to forgive. She was the only person outside his father's inner circle who knew the truth of what he was doing, and even she, with all her teasing, understood why he had done it. He set the phone down on the wobbly wooden table that served as his only furniture besides the bed and a single plastic chair, and he allowed himself a long breath. Outside, the sound of a motorcycle taxi honking its way through the narrow street reminded him that in an hour he was expected at the Basie compound, where Ada worked 3 evenings a week helping the elderly matron of the house, and where he, in his role as just Michael, the driver who lost his job, had taken to lingering under the guise of walking her home. It had started as an accident, this whole charade. 6 weeks ago, Michael Williams, heir to Williams Industries, a name that opened doors from Lagos to London to New York, had been driving through the outskirts of the city in an unmarked car, alone, no security detail, no assistant trailing 2 steps behind him, testing what his father called the discipline of humility, as part of some absurd initiation his grandfather had insisted upon before Michael could formally take his seat on the board. He was meant to spend 3 months living without the trappings of his name, learning, his father had said, with that maddening calm certainty he always carried, what it meant to be a man before he could be permitted to call himself the future of the company. Michael had thought it a foolish exercise, a performance, a box to check before the real inheritance began. And then he had seen her. Ada Basie had been standing at the roadside with a stalled Okada and a bag of groceries spilling out onto the dust, cursing under her breath in a mixture of English and Efik that made him laugh before he could stop himself. She had turned, glaring at him with a fire in her eyes that no woman in his circle had ever dared direct at him, and demanded, without a shred of deference, that he stop staring and help her lift the bike instead. He had gotten out of the car. He had helped her lift the bike. And somewhere between the spilled tomatoes and her sharp, unimpressed thank you, something in him had shifted, quietly, irrevocably, like a key turning in a lock he hadn't known was there. He had not told her his name that day. When she asked, he had said Michael, true enough, and when she asked what he did, the answer had come out of him before he could examine it. I used to drive for a company. Lost the job last month. It was not entirely false. He had driven the car that day. He had, in a manner of speaking, no formal employment, since the position of heir apparent did not come with a paycheck stub. It was a lie built cleverly out of half-truths, the kind of lie that let him sleep at night by telling himself he had never really lied at all. But 6 weeks later, the lie had grown roots. It had grown roots in the warm cup of tea Ada's mother pressed into his hands every evening he visited. It had grown roots in the easy laughter of Ada's younger brother, who had taken to calling him Uncle Mike and following him around like a shadow. It had grown roots, most of all, in the way Ada looked at him, not with the calculated warmth of a woman assessing what he could offer her, not with the practiced admiration he had grown so used to from women who knew exactly whose son he was, but with something plainer, sturdier. Something that felt, for the first time in his 29 years, like being seen. He glanced at the small clock on the table. 5:40. He had less than 20 minutes before he was due to meet her outside the Basie compound, and he still needed to change out of the shirt Norah had teased him about. A shirt that, despite being one of the cheapest things he owned, still bore the faint, unmistakable stitching of a tailor whose other clients included 2 African presidents and a Grammy-winning musician. He had learned, in his weeks of playing ordinary, to be careful about such details. A stitch here, a fabric there, the kind of thing no one in Addis would ever notice. Except that he could not risk it. Not now. Not when the ruse had become something he wanted, quite desperately, to protect. He changed his shirt for a plainer one, checked his reflection in the cracked mirror nailed unevenly to the wall, and left the apartment. The walk to the Basie compound took 12 minutes if he moved briskly, past the roasted plantain seller who always called out a greeting to him now, past the tailor's shop where 3 young apprentices sat cross-legged on the floor threading buttons, past the church whose choir was already beginning its evening rehearsal, voices rising in a hymn that drifted out through the open windows and mixed with the smell of frying akara from the stall next door. Michael had walked this route so many times now that his feet knew it without thought, and there was a strange, quiet pleasure in that, in belonging, even falsely, to the rhythm of a place. He found Ada already outside, sweeping the front steps of the compound with the brisk, efficient motion of someone who had done the chore 1,000 times before and would do it 1,000 times again without complaint. She was wearing a faded blue wrapper tied at her waist, her hair bound back in a scarf that had slipped slightly to one side. And when she looked up and saw him, her whole face changed. Not dramatically, not the way it might in the exaggerated romance of a stage play, but subtly, the way morning changes when the sun clears the last cloud. A small smile, a softening around the eyes. "You're late," she said, though there was no real accusation in it. "By 2 minutes," Michael said, glancing at his watch, a plain, unremarkable watch he had bought specifically for this life, though his hands still remembered the weight of the one he usually wore, a gift from his grandfather that could have paid for this entire street twice over. 2 minutes is still late. Ada set the broom against the wall and wiped her hands on her wrapper. "Mama Ngozi says hello, by the way. She wants to know when you're going to fix that gate hinge you promised to look at." Michael winced internally. He knew nothing about gate hinges. He knew a great deal about mergers and acquisitions, about the delicate art of negotiating shipping contracts across 3 continents, about which vintage of wine paired best with a boardroom apology. But a gate hinge was, in every practical sense, entirely beyond him. He had spent an embarrassing hour last week watching a YouTube tutorial on his phone, sitting on the floor of his apartment like a schoolboy, determined not to be exposed as a fraud by something as small as a squeaking gate. "Tell her I'll come by this weekend," he said. "You said that last weekend too." "This weekend, I mean it." Ada laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind that made the corners of her eyes crinkle, and gestured for him to follow her inside. "Come. Mama's cooking aguzi. She made too much again, as usual. She says you eat like a man who hasn't had a decent meal in years, and honestly, Michael, at this point I'm starting to agree with her." If only she knew, Michael thought, following her through the gate and into the small, warmly lit compound, that I have eaten at tables set with silver that costs more than this entire street, and none of it, has ever tasted half as good as whatever your mother puts in that pot. Inside, the compound was alive with the particular chaos of a household in the middle of its evening rituals. Ada's younger brother, Emeka, was chasing a scrawny chicken across the yard with the single-minded fury of a boy convinced he was destined to catch it. Mama Ada, whom everyone, out of long habit and affection, simply called Mama, sat on a low stool outside the kitchen door, stirring a pot that filled the whole compound with a rich, nutty smell of aguzi soup. Her new phone, the one Michael had bought her, propped carefully on a stool beside her, screen glowing faintly as she waited, he suspected, for a call from a cousin in another town. "Ah, Michael!" Mama called out the moment she saw him, her face breaking into the wide, unguarded smile that had, in 6 short weeks, become one of the things he looked forward to most in his day. "You've come. Good, good. Sit, sit. The soup is almost ready." "Good evening, Mama." He crossed the yard and settled onto the wooden bench near her, the same bench he had come to think of, quietly, as his own. "How was your day?" "Ah, my day was good, I spoke to Ada's auntie on your phone." She patted the device beside her with something close to reverence, as though it were a small, precious animal she had recently adopted. "You know, before, I had to walk to Mama Chidi's house next door just to borrow her phone, and then I had to sit there while she listened to everything I was saying, pretending she wasn't listening. You understand? Now I can talk from my own kitchen. You have done a great thing for me, Michael. A great thing." "It was nothing, Mama." "It was not nothing." Mama fixed him with a look that was, for a moment, startlingly perceptive, the kind of look that made Michael wonder, not for the first time, whether the old woman saw more of him than he gave her credit for. A man who has lost his job, spending money like that on an old woman he barely knows, that is not nothing, my son. That is character. You understand me? Character is not what a man has. It is what he does when nobody is asking him to do it. Michael felt something tighten in his chest, a complicated knot of guilt and gratitude that he had grown almost used to carrying whenever he was in this compound. He thought of his father, who measured character in balance sheets and quarterly reports, who had built an empire on the principle that trust was a resource to be spent carefully, never given freely. He thought of the board members who smiled at him with their teeth and calculated, behind those smiles, exactly how much his approval was worth to their own ambitions. And here was this woman who owned nothing but a small compound and a new phone and a pot of soup, telling him with absolute conviction that he had character, as though character were the simplest thing in the world to recognize once you stopped looking for it in the wrong places. "Thank you, Mama," he said quietly, and found that he meant it more than he had meant almost anything he'd said in the boardrooms of his other life. Ada appeared beside him with 2 plates, setting one in his hands with the easy familiarity of routine. "Eat before it gets cold. And don't let Mama's talk go to your head. She says that to everyone who does her a favor. Last month she told the meter reader he had the face of a future president." "He did have a very honest face," Mama said, unbothered, stirring her pot. Michael laughed, and the sound surprised him, an easy, unguarded laugh, the kind he rarely produced in his other life, where laughter was so often a performance, a social lubricant deployed strategically rather than felt. Here, in this yard, with the smell of agusy soup and the sound of Emika's futile chicken chase and Ada settling onto the bench beside him with her own plate, laughter came without calculation. It simply arrived, the way rain arrives, indifferent to permission. They ate in comfortable quiet for a while, the kind of quiet that Michael had learned, in these 6 weeks, was its own kind of luxury, the freedom to simply exist beside someone without the need to fill every silence with strategy or small talk designed to extract information. In his other life, silence was suspicious. Silence meant someone was calculating, or hiding something, or preparing to ask for a favor. Here, silence was just silence. Comfortable. Undemanding. "You're quiet tonight," Ada said eventually, glancing sideways at him. "Just thinking." "About what?" "About how strange it is," he wanted to say, "that 6 weeks ago I did not know your name, and now I cannot imagine an evening that does not end here, on this bench, eating your mother's soup." But he could not say that. Not yet. Perhaps not ever, if Norah's warnings held any weight. "About the gate hinge," he said instead, and Ada rolled her eyes. "Liar. You weren't thinking about the gate hinge. You have never once thought about that gate hinge, not since the day you promised to fix it." "I think about it constantly. It haunts me." Am. She took another spoonful of soup, unconvinced, but there was warmth in her skepticism, the kind of warmth that came from knowing someone well enough to tease them without malice. "You know, Mama thinks you're too thin. She's decided it's her personal mission to fatten you up before the end of the year." "I'm not too thin." "You're not fat, either, which in Mama's book counts as too thin." Ada set her plate down and studied him for a moment, her expression shifting into something more careful, more searching. "Can I ask you something?" Something in her tone made Michael's pulse quicken, not with fear, exactly, but with the particular wariness of a man who had spent 6 weeks building a wall of half-truths and was never quite certain when a single question might bring the whole structure down. "Of course. Why don't you talk about your family? You've mentioned your mother once, in passing, and never again. You never talk about where you grew up, or what your father did, or anything, really. It's like you appeared out of nowhere, 6 weeks ago, standing beside my broken-down Okada." Michael's mind moved quickly, the way it always did in moments like this, sifting through the careful architecture of truths and omissions he had constructed to protect the fragile thing growing between them. "My family and I don't speak much," he said, which was, in its own twisted way, almost true. He had barely spoken to his father since this whole exercise began, communicating mostly through Norah, who served as his unlikely intermediary. "It's complicated. My father and I don't see eye to eye on a lot of things. What I should do with my life. Who I should be. That sounds hard. It is, sometimes. He looked down at his plate, turning the spoon over in his fingers. He has very specific ideas about what success looks like, about what kind of man I should become. And I think I've spent a long time trying to be that man, and only recently started wondering if I even want to be him at all. It was, he realized as he said it, the truest thing he had told her since the day they met. Truer, in its way, than any of the small, deliberate lies he had constructed to protect his secret. Because underneath the elaborate deception of Michael Ezzy, the unemployed driver, was a truth Michael Williams had never quite found the courage to say aloud in his own world. That the life laid out for him, gilded and vast and enviable as it was, had never once felt like it belonged to him. Ada was quiet for a moment, studying him with an intensity that made him want to look away and, at the same time, made him unable to. You know, she said finally, whoever that man is that your father wants you to be, I don't know him, and I don't particularly care about him. I know the man who helped me lift my Okada off the road. I know the man who bought my mother a phone so she wouldn't have to beg her neighbors for one. I know the man who lets my little brother tell him the same story about the football match 3 times a week and pretends it's the first time he's hearing it. That's the man I care about, Michael. Whatever your father thinks success looks like, I don't think it looks anything like a bad idea. Michael felt something crack open in his chest, warm and terrifying in equal measure. He thought of Norah's words on the phone earlier. The day Ada finds out who you really are, everything will be different. And for the first time, the thought did not simply frighten him. It grieved him, deeply and specifically, in a way he had not expected. Because sitting here, in this yard, being looked at by this woman as though he were simply, sufficiently, enough, he understood, with sudden and total clarity, exactly what he stood to lose the moment the truth came out. Thank you, he said quietly, because it was the only thing he could manage to say without saying too much. Mama, from her stool by the pot, glanced between the two of them with the knowing, unhurried patience of a woman who had lived long enough to recognize the particular silence that falls between two people who are beginning, whether they admit it to themselves or not, to fall in love. She said nothing. She simply smiled to herself and stirred her soup a little slower than necessary, giving the evening the room it seemed to need. It was Emeka who broke the moment, finally cornering the chicken with a triumphant shout that sent the bird squawking indignantly across the yard, and the ordinary chaos of the evening rushed back in. Mama scolding him for frightening her hens, Ada laughing despite herself, the last of the daylight fading into the soft violet of an Addis evening. Later, after the plates were cleared and Emeka had been sent, protesting, to bed, Michael walked with Ada to the gate, the same routine they had fallen into over the past weeks, a small ritual that had become, without either of them naming it as such, the closest thing to courtship either of them had time or courage for. Same time Thursday? Ada asked, leaning against the gatepost. Same time Thursday, Michael confirmed. She studied him for a moment in the dim light of the single bulb hanging above the gate, her expression softening into something quieter, more private than the easy teasing of the dinner table. You're a good man, Michael Ezzy, she said. Whatever your father thinks, whatever mistakes you think you've made, I hope you know that. He wanted, more than he had wanted almost anything in his carefully constructed life, to tell her the truth right then. To say, my name isn't really Ezzy, not entirely, and I am not unemployed, and my father is not simply a difficult man but one of the most powerful industrialists on the continent, and none of that changes what I feel for you. Please, please don't let it change what you feel for me. But the words caught somewhere behind his teeth, weighted down by 6 weeks of careful lies and the very real fear that the truth, however honestly delivered, would sound like betrayal. Good night, Ada, he said instead, and the words felt smaller than what was in his chest. Good night, Michael. He watched her disappear back through the gate before he turned and began the walk home, the streets quieter now, the church choir long since finished, the plant and cellar packing up her stall for the night. He walked slowly, turning Ada's words over and over in his mind. Whoever that man is that your father wants you to be, I don't know him, and I don't particularly care about him, and felt, for the first time since this whole strange experiment had begun, the true weight of what he was building. Not a lie, exactly, or not only a lie, a choice. Every evening he spent in that compound, Every plate of egusi soup, every conversation with Mama about the price of Gary or the state of the church roof, every walk to the gate with Ada. All of it was a choice to remain just a little longer in a world where he was valued for nothing more and nothing less than the simple decency of his presence. A world where his name meant nothing, and so his actions had to mean everything. His phone buzzed in his pocket as he reached the corner of his street. He pulled it out, expecting another text from Norah, some fresh piece of teasing about his poverty. Instead, the screen showed a name that made his stomach drop with sudden, cold weight. Dad. Michael stood frozen on the corner for a long moment, the phone glowing in his palm, the noise of the street fading into a distant hum around him. His father never called. In 6 weeks, not once. Communication had always run through Norah, a careful buffer his father had agreed to as part of the terms of this strange initiation. You will not be reached directly, Michael, not unless it is a matter of true importance. Which meant that whatever this was, it was not small. He hesitated only a moment before answering, his voice carefully arranged into the measured calm he had spent a lifetime perfecting for exactly these situations. Dad. Michael. His father's voice was clipped, businesslike, betraying nothing of warmth or apology for the interruption. I need you back in Lagos by Monday morning. Michael's grip tightened around the phone. The arrangement was 3 months, Dad. It's only been 6 weeks. The arrangement has changed. A pause, heavy with the particular weight his father reserved for announcements he knew would not be well received. The board is moving up the transition timeline. There are people circling, Michael, investors who think the company is vulnerable without a clear successor in place, competitors who smell blood in the water while you're off playing at being ordinary. I need you back. I need you visible. I need the Williams name attached to a face the market can trust, and I need it by Monday. Michael closed his eyes, the noise of the street rushing back and around him, a motorcycle horn, a burst of laughter from a nearby bar, the distant, indifferent hum of a city that had no idea it was about to swallow the fragile, ordinary life he had built inside it whole. Monday, he repeated quietly. Monday, his father confirmed. Whatever you've been doing out there, son, I hope it was worth it, because it ends now. The line went dead. Michael stood on the corner for a long time afterward, staring at the dark screen of his phone, the sounds of the street around him suddenly distant and unreal, as though he were already halfway gone from this place, already halfway back to the marble floors and the boardrooms and the name that would, in a matter of days, undo everything he had spent 6 weeks so carefully building. Somewhere behind him, back through the gate, back past the sleeping chicken coop and the cooling pot of egusi soup, Ada was likely already asleep, unaware that the man she had promised to see again on Thursday was standing 3 streets away with his entire fabricated world collapsing quietly around his ears. He thought of her voice at the gate, "You're a good man, Michael Ezzy," and felt, with sudden and terrible clarity, that come Monday, Michael Ezzy would cease to exist entirely, and in his place would stand a stranger she had never agreed to love. The walk back to his apartment that night felt longer than the 12 minutes it usually took. Michael moved through the darkened streets of Addis with his father's words looping through his mind like a chant he could not silence. Whatever you've been doing out there, son, I hope it was worth it, because it ends now. And by the time he reached his building, climbing the narrow, unlit staircase to the 2nd floor, he understood that a decision was already forming inside him, one he had not consciously made but which felt, nonetheless, inevitable. He was not ready to let this end. Inside the apartment, he sat on the edge of his bed without turning on the light, the city noise filtering faintly through the thin window glass, and dialed Norah's number before he had fully decided what he was going to say. She answered on the 2nd ring, her voice sharp with immediate concern. Michael? It's almost midnight. What's? My father called. A pause on the other end, brief but telling. Norah, who had spent a decade as his closest confidant inside the company, who understood the rhythms of his father's moods better than almost anyone besides the man himself, seemed to grasp instantly the significance of those 3 words. He never calls. He does now. Michael pressed his palm against his forehead, the beginnings of a headache gathering behind his eyes. He wants me back in Lagos by Monday. Says the board is spooked, competitors are circling, they need a face on the company before the market decides to panic. He's ending the arrangement early. Monday. Norah exhaled slowly. That's 4 days. I know. Michael. Her voice softened, and he could hear the careful way she was choosing her next words, the way she always did when she was about to say something he did not particularly want to hear. You knew this day was coming. You knew it wasn't going to be 3 months of playing house in Addis forever. At some point. I know that, Norah. The words came out sharper than he intended, and he pressed his eyes shut, forcing his voice back into something calmer. I'm not stupid. I always knew this would end. I just thought I'd have more time to figure out how to end it without. He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Without breaking her heart, Norah finished for him, quiet and unflinching, the way only she could be with him. Michael said nothing for a long moment, staring at the faint outline of the window across the dark room. Yes, he said finally, without breaking her heart. And mine, if I'm honest. Norah was quiet on the other end, and when she spoke again, the teasing edge that usually colored her voice had softened into something gentler, more serious than he was used to hearing from her. Do you love her, Michael? The question landed in the dark room like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through him that he had spent 6 weeks carefully avoiding. He thought of Ada at the gate, the particular way she said his name, his false name, and yet the only name that had ever made him feel like a whole person rather than a title, a fortune, a succession plan waiting to be executed. He thought of Mama's soup, of Emika's chicken, of the bench in the yard that had become, without his ever deciding it, the place where he felt most himself. Yes, he said, and the word came out rougher than he expected, thick with everything he had been refusing to name even to himself. I love her, Norah. I think I've loved her for weeks now, and I didn't want to admit it because admitting it meant admitting that I was going to have to choose, eventually, between the truth and this thing we've built. And I don't know how to choose. I don't know how to walk into that compound and tell her that everything she thinks she knows about me is a lie. It's not all a lie, Norah said gently. You said it yourself once. You told her the truth about the things that mattered. Your name is partly true. Your character has been true this whole time. Every kindness you've shown that family has been real, Michael. The only lie is your bank account and your last name. Everything else, the way you care for them, the way you've let yourself be ordinary with them, that's the truest version of you I've seen in years. Michael felt something tighten and release in his chest at once, gratitude and grief tangled together. Then why does it feel like the moment I tell her the truth, I'll lose everything that made it real? Because you're afraid, Norah said simply, that she loved Michael Ezzy the driver and won't know how to love Michael Williams the heir. But Michael, you are Michael Ezzy the driver. That's not a costume you put on. That's who you've let yourself become when nobody was watching. And I think, deep down, you're terrified that the moment your father's name gets attached to you again, that man disappears completely. Not because Ada will stop loving him, because you're afraid you'll stop being him. The words settled over him with an accuracy that left him briefly unable to respond. He sat in the dark, the phone pressed to his ear, and felt, for the first time, the true shape of his fear. Not that Ada would reject him for his wealth, though that fear was real too, but that the wealth itself, the return to his old life, would swallow whatever gentler, truer version of himself he had found here, in this small apartment, on that wooden bench, in the particular quiet of Mama's kitchen. I don't know what to do, Norah, he admitted, and it was perhaps the most honest thing he had said to anyone in years. You have 4 days, Norah said. Use them. Whatever you decide. Tell her the truth, or don't, or find some third option neither of us has thought of yet. Don't let her find out from someone else. Don't let her open a newspaper one day and see your face under a headline about the Williams succession and realize you let her learn it that way. Whatever you do, Michael, she deserves better than that. You're right. He rubbed his hand over his face, exhaustion beginning to press down on him now that the adrenaline of his father's call was fading into something heavier. I'll figure it out. You always do, Norah said, though there was less certainty in her voice than usual. Get some sleep. You sound like you need it. After she hung up, Michael sat alone in the dark for a long while, the city noise outside slowly quieting as the night deepened, and found that sleep, when it finally came, offered little relief. He dreamed, disjointedly, of the compound gate swinging open onto an empty yard, of Mama's pot boiling over with no one there to tend it, of Ada standing in the doorway of a house that was no longer hers, watching him drive away in a car too grand for the street it was parked on. He woke before dawn, the apartment still dim with the last shadows of night, and lay staring at the water-stained ceiling for a long time before he rose, dressed, and began, without quite deciding to, planning how he might use the 4 days he had left. Thursday came faster than he wanted it to. He arrived at the compound at his usual hour, the sun beginning its slow descent behind the rooftops of Addis, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that seemed, to Michael's heightened awareness, unbearably beautiful, the kind of beauty a man only truly notices when he understands he is looking at something for one of the last times. Ada was waiting for him by the gate, arms crossed, a teasing smile already forming. "You're early tonight." "Wanted to make up for Tuesday's lateness," he said, and the effort of keeping his voice light cost him more than he expected. She studied him for a moment, her smile faltering slightly as something in his expression registered with her. The particular strain he had not managed to fully hide, despite his best efforts. "You look tired. Didn't sleep well. Bad dreams?" "You have no idea," he thought, but said only something like that. She reached out, without hesitation, and took his hand, a small gesture, but one that had become, over the past weeks, a quiet ritual between them, a wordless acknowledgement of the thing neither of them had yet named aloud. "Come inside. Mama made jollof tonight. She says you've been looking thin again." "Mama always says I look thin." "Mama is always right." Ada led him through the gate, and for a while, the ordinary rhythms of the evening carried him along. Emeka's excited recounting of a football match he had watched at a friend's house, Mama's running commentary on the price of rice at the market, the warm, familiar clatter of plates and spoons around the low table in the yard. Michael found himself watching it all with a strange, aching intensity, committing details to memory the way a man commits to memory the face of someone he fears he will not see again. The particular way Emeka gestured wildly with his hands when excited, the small, satisfied hum Mama made when she tasted her own cooking and found it good, the sound of Ada's laughter, unguarded and full, rising above the evening noise of the compound. 4 days, he thought. I have 4 days of this left, and then Monday comes, and everything changes. He had spent the better part of the previous day turning over every possible solution in his mind, weighing the risks of confession against the cowardice of silence, and had arrived, by evening, at no clear answer, only a growing certainty that whatever he chose, it needed to be a choice made with his eyes open, not a decision forced upon him by circumstance. After dinner, as the compound settled into its familiar evening quiet, Ada walked with him to the gate as she always did. But tonight, instead of the usual easy parting, she lingered, studying his face with the same careful attention she had shown earlier. "Michael," she said finally, "something's wrong. You've been strange all evening. Distracted. What is it?" He looked at her in the dim light of the gate's single bulb and felt the full weight of the choice pressing down on him. The choice between the easy comfort of continued silence and the terrifying vulnerability of truth. He thought of Norah's words, "She deserves better than to find out from someone else." He thought of his father's voice on the phone, Monday. He thought of Mama's declaration, delivered with such simple conviction, "Character is what a man does when nobody is asking him to do it." And he understood, standing there in the fading light, that the most honorable version of himself, the version he wanted, desperately, to become worthy of the love this family had given him so freely, would not walk away without at least attempting the truth. "Ada," he said slowly, "there's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you weeks ago." Her expression shifted, wariness creeping into her eyes, though she said nothing, only waited, her hand still loosely curled in his. "My name isn't entirely what you think it is," he began, his voice steadier than he expected, though his heart hammered against his ribs with a force that felt almost violent. "Ezzy is real. It was my grandmother's name, but it's not the name most people know me by. My full name is Michael Williams." He watched her face carefully as the name registered, watched the small furrow of confusion crease her brow as she searched her memory for context she did not yet have. "Williams," she repeated slowly. As in Williams Industries," Michael said, forcing himself to continue before his courage failed him entirely. My father is Solomon Williams. I'm not an unemployed driver, Ada. I never was. I'm the heir to one of the largest companies on this continent, and 6 weeks ago, my father sent me out here as part of some initiation, some test he insisted I complete before he'd let me take my place at the company. I wasn't supposed to fall in love with anyone. I certainly wasn't supposed to fall in love with you. But I did, and I've spent every day since trying to figure out how to tell you the truth without losing everything I've found here, and I don't think there's a way to do that gently. So I'm telling you now, because you deserve to know, and because my father called last night and told me I have to go back to Lagos by Monday, and I couldn't let you find out from a headline or a stranger. I needed you to hear it from me. The silence that followed felt endless. Ada had gone very still, her hands slipping slowly from his, her eyes fixed on his face with an expression Michael could not fully read. Shock, certainly, but beneath it something harder to name, something that made his stomach twist with dread. Say something, he said finally, when the silence had stretched past what he could bear. I don't. Ada shook her head slowly, taking a step back, putting distance between them that felt, to Michael, like the physical manifestation of everything he had feared. 6 weeks, Michael. 6 weeks of dinners at my mother's table. 6 weeks of my brother following you around like you hung the moon. 6 weeks of my mother telling everyone who'll listen about the kind young man helping her daughter. And this whole time, you were, what, exactly? Playing at being poor. Slumming it in my neighborhood for some kind of character-building exercise your father cooked up. It wasn't like that. Wasn't it? Her voice cracked, sharp with a hurt that cut deeper than anger. Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like that. You let my mother believe you needed her phone gift more than you needed the appearance of generosity. You let my brother believe you were his friend, someone like him, someone who understood what it means to not have very much. You let me believe. She stopped abruptly, pressing her lips together, and Michael watched, helpless, as she fought to compose herself. You let me believe I was falling in love with a man who had nothing to offer me but himself. And it turns out I don't even know who that self is. You do know, Michael said desperately, closing the distance she had put between them, though he did not touch her, sensing instinctively that she would not welcome it now. Ada, everything I've shown you these past 6 weeks, the way I care about you, the way I care about your family, none of that was a lie. My name was different, my circumstances were different, but the man who sat on that bench and ate your mother's soup and let Emeka tell him the same story 3 times a week, that man is real. That man is me. The only thing I hid was money. Everything else was true.